Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Ed Bouchette. Ed is a Hall of Fame Pittsburgh Steelers writer, currently working in The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Ed about his early days in print journalism, covering the historic Pittsburgh Steelers franchise, his approach to writing the Super Bowl, as well as his transition from print to digital media. The Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles is now at 30 episodes, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has liked, rated, watched, and subscribed to my podcast. I look forward to providing more of these in-depth conversations with athletes and sports media figures down the road. As always, the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 30 with Ed Bouchette on the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Ed Bouchette. He is a Pittsburgh Steelers beat writer for The Athletic, longtime sports journalist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, as well as a Dick McCann Memorial Award winner. Ed, welcome to the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
I'm good. I'm quarantined, but not really quarantined, but you know what I mean? Since this is the Quarantine Chronicle.
For sure. We're both stuck in our homes. Probably a year ago, we'd be, traveling, covering sports, but alas, things can change a lot in a year, let alone a few months. But I wanted to start, Ed, about some news about the Pittsburgh Steelers, because I know that a lot of my listeners are Canadian, and the Steelers drafted a Canadian, Chase Claypool. So maybe, you haven't seen Chase yet in action, but from what you've heard, what is Chase going to bring to the Pittsburgh Steelers organization?
Well, size and speed is the big things, Lucas. They don't have anybody as fast as him, and they don't have anybody as tall as him, really. None of their primary guys. And I compared him to some guys they've had here before, but really they haven't had one. Even Antonio Brown was a small guy, and he wasn't exceptionally speedy. He just had a knack of getting open. So if Chase, everything they say about him sounds good, if he can come in and adapt to the offense, learn it, and run his routes right, he'll get along real well with Ben Roethlisberger.
No, for sure. And of course, Pittsburgh has a long history of wide receivers. Then Chase is an interesting story because, here's a guy from Abbotsford, British Columbia, which is a small town in Western Canada. And he doesn't go to prep school in Canada. He doesn't go to prep school in the United States, which a lot of Canadian football players do to get noticed. He stays at his high school in Abbotsford. And, somehow then, he ends up at Notre Dame, and the rest is history. And here's a guy that can, played multiple positions during high school and college. So he's a very fascinating story, and certainly, proud that, Canada is able to, have him.
Yeah, and at 230 some pounds, to be that fast at 6'2" is really enticing. I saw a story before the combine that he thought he might be a tight end in the NFL, but then he ran that speed, and they said, no, you'll be a wide receiver. And the Steelers were looking at him. He caught their eye as a junior because they thought he might come out as a junior, and they were watching him then. So they've had their eye on him for a couple years now, but he can really, like I said, if he can fit in, and the lack of spring stuff is going to hurt all these rookies from fitting right in. But I think receiver is one of those positions they can limit what he has to do, especially at the X position on the outside. That's when Mike Wallace ran. Mike Tomlin always called him a one-trick pony because all he did was go, woo,
Yep.
and they threw him the ball. And that's what they can do with Chase as a rookie if he's not assimilated into all the offense.
And I want to get into your career as a sports journalist. And like I said off the top, I mean, you've spent a lot of time with the Pittsburgh Steelers organization covering this team. And for any of my listeners who may not know about the Pittsburgh Steelers, I mean, what does this team mean to the city of Pittsburgh?
Well, it meant a whole lot more, I think, in the 70s. I really do, because they hadn't won in years. You know, they were born in 33 and hadn't been in a playoff game. Well, they were in a playoff game, hadn't won a playoff game in almost 40 years before the Immaculate Reception in 72. And all of a sudden, boom, Super Bowls are flying left and right into Pittsburgh. And they won 4 in 6 years, and the place just exploded. They're still big, don't get me wrong, and they still mean a lot to this city. But I still think in the 70s, and it was a bigger population here back then when the steel mills were humming too. I think in the 70s they were really, really a whole lot bigger. They dominated everything, and the Penguins have risen since then. Of course, the Pirates have fallen, but it's still the number one thing in town, and they still sell out every game. Have ever since that 72 season.
And what made you want to become a sports writer, Ed?
It's funny. I have a nice degree in business management from a school here, Indiana University of Pennsylvania. But while I was there was a little ad in the student paper. They needed somebody to cover what was then freshman basketball. And I said, I could do that. And that just got me interested in it. And they hired me in the PR office. I was writing press releases and stringing for local papers and keeping stats and writing program pieces. And by the time I graduated, that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be an accountant or a retail manager somewhere. I wanted to do that. So I got 6 offers. Back then, there were still a lot of newspapers.
Yeah. And
they were publishing every day. And I just followed that. I worked at a bunch of small papers until I landed at the Post-Gazette in 83. And I started with the Steeler Beat in 85.
And you talk about those experiences at smaller papers. What did you learn by working at the smaller papers that allowed you to learn the ropes of being a writer and a journalist?
Well, you learn everything, first of all, more than just writing. I was a sports editor of a 2-man staff back a long time ago, and I decided I wanted to also – we had to cover college, we had to cover high schools, you covered summer leagues, all that stuff, 2 of us. We had some stringers, but that's what you learn. You learn to write fast because you're covering so much stuff, and you got to write that story, and then you got to write the headline, and then you got to go back in the shop and help them put it together on the page, all that good stuff, inside baseball stuff. So you learn, and also I had the freedom at a couple places to write what I wanted to write, pretty much. If I saw something I wanted to write, I wrote it. I didn't have to ask somebody. I wrote it. I put it in the paper, and that helped. And you also, with small papers, you're dealing with a lot of different people, a lot of different sports. So I learned how to cover wrestling, which I never even saw a wrestling match other than, Bruno Sammartino. I never saw a real wrestling match. I never covered one. And I covered everything, and I did stories, millions of different kinds of stories. I wrote a story on Evel Knievel when people were throwing rocks at us inside his little trailer that he had set up in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
That's a story in itself. But stuff like that, you get to do all that stuff. And then when the Steeler Beat came along and they put me on it, I liked it. I never set out and said, I want to cover the Steelers. I just wanted to work in a newspaper and, get paid to do it and enjoy it. I wanted to be in sports. And, once I started covering the Steelers, I just enjoyed it. It's a good lifestyle too, Lucas, with all the daylight work. Covering those other sports can wear you out. You work at night, you're on deadline all the time. They play it, most of their games at night. At least we only have 4 or 5 at night, but all the other work during the week's during the day.
And you mentioned those experiences about covering, high school sports and wrestling, because I find that for a lot of young writers, you have to, cover those unique beats early on, because I find that, that's how you get to a level like you where you can cover a professional sports team. Because I find, sometimes with a lot of young writers, they're so eager to get that top beat, and that's great to dream big, but sometimes you got to start off a little small by covering those odd beats to get you that experience before you can cover a big team.
Yeah, Lucas, there's all kinds of ways to skin the cat. I've worked with people who went straight from college to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and they were good journalists. And there are a lot of us out there, some buddies of mine on the beat at the Post-Gazette, like Jerry Dulac. He worked at small paper. In fact, years ago, we worked on the same small paper in McKeesport, Pennsylvania together. But you do learn, I think you learn a lot. And I probably worked at 5 different little papers before I went to the Post-Gazette. And you work with different editors, some good, some maybe not so good, and you learn many different things from them. And that's what I did, and I think it really helped my career. Now, I feel bad for young writers now because there's not as many opportunities as I had. And, the small papers, I was just reading on Pointer, they're a lot of them are going under on this coronavirus. Mm-hmm. And it's just the opportunities just are not going to be there. They're going to have to find something on the internet somewhere.
No, certainly digital, writing has become a lot more prevalent, and we'll talk about your transition from print to digital, because you obviously are now at The Athletic. But in 1979, when doing research for this interview, I noticed that you had the chance to cover the Pittsburgh Pirates win the World Series, and then a few months later, the Pittsburgh Steelers win the Super Bowl. And I guess it sort of speaks to your experience about sort of parachuting into different sports. I guess that really helped you when you were able to, cover baseball, and then a few months later be able to cover the Pittsburgh Steelers in football winning the Super Bowl. So I'm just curious about what those months were like. Must have been pretty exciting for the city and for a young writer like yourself.
Well, it sure was, Lucas. I was working at the Tribune Review back then. It became the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, but it was a community paper, a suburban paper, but we covered a lot of stuff. And we had maybe a 8-man staff. And they put me on the Pirates. And they won, they went to the World Series. So I covered them. I covered that World Series at home and in Baltimore. I covered the championship game against Cincinnati. In fact, I just wrote about all this about a couple months ago in The Athletic, my experience doing that. And it was something. They had the auxiliary press box behind home plate in old Baltimore Memorial Stadium. Mm-hmm. And that's where they put us, with plywood desks. And I had a portable typewriter. Now, are you kidding me? We'd be out in left field. Those seats would be selling for thousands of dollars behind home plate. They wouldn't be putting us there for free. Anyway, and then, so I came home. I wrote another story or two after I was on the Pirates charter, actually, coming home. And then I wrote another story or two. And then that Friday, I had to go cover a high school football camp. And then in January, of course, the Steelers, I covered all the Steelers home games, some of the away games. My boss covered every game, and he let me go to some of the away games, but I went to all the home games. So I covered all the playoff games that year and the Super Bowl. I went to the Super Bowl and was out at the Rose Bowl, and of course they won. It was a pretty good game against a 9-7 Rams team. And, I was 28 years old, and I couldn't have fallen into it anymore. In fact, when I first went to the Tribune Review, they put me on Pitt football, That was 1976, Tony Dorsett's senior year, and they won the national championship. So I kind of take credit for a lot of this, Lucas, a lot of the success these teams have had here.
Well, you're a good luck charm because, Pittsburgh has been, blessed with a lot of championships since you started covering them. But I want to get to your days at the Post-Gazette covering the Steelers. So now, you've had the chance, to be with the team before, but now you're on the Steelers beat. And I'm curious just the challenges that come with that back then, because, here's a team that had just won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. The city's going crazy about the team. I guess there's a real, gravity with every piece that you write, just given the attention that's placed on the Steeler organization.
Yeah, I was dropped on that beat with 3 days left of training camp in 1985. They had hired somebody, and they didn't like the job he was doing, and I was covering Pitt, and they said, "You're now on the Steelers." So I went out there with 3 days left, and fortunately, I had been around that team, here and there with the other papers. Even when I was at the Post-Gazette, they sent me out once in a while to do a Steelers story. So I was familiar with Chuck Noll and Dan Rooney and all those people and some of the players. But I had to hit the ground running because Ron Cook of the Pittsburgh Press, who's now a columnist with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, was the beat guy, and he was really good. We both tangled for our competitive papers for the USFL Maulers the first time in '84. So we were back at it in '85, and you couldn't sleep. I mean, and there were no cell phones. If you wanted to call an agent, and you left a message, if he didn't answer, and you hung by your phone until he called you back. You couldn't just walk around with a cell phone in your pocket. It was interesting times. There were a lot of good stories back in the 80s. The Steelers were fading. I just told you I was the good luck charm, but in '84, the year before I was on the beat, they made the AFC title game. Dan Marino beat them. And then in '85 was the first of 4 straight years of Chuck Noll not making the playoffs. In fact, 6 of his last 7 years as coach, he did not make the playoffs. And I wasn't much of a good luck charm back then, Lucas. But the stories were good. It was more wide open, the access, than I know I'm getting to inside baseball again a little bit, but the access was better. I could walk into the general manager's office. I could walk into any assistant coach's office, see him and say, "Hey, you mind if I stop down?" Now, if I did that, I'd be arrested.
Yeah, the access has certainly changed over the years, and it's certainly decreased over time, I imagine. But you talk about how you used to write on typewriters, and there were no cell phones, and of course me growing up, like I've grown up in the age of social media, laptops, cell phones, etc. So I'm curious, for you as a journalist, was that transition difficult to master, going from these old forms of technology to now the newer forms?
Only a couple times. The first thing they went to after you had a regular typewriter, and we had electric typewriters in the office, they went to this editing thing where they gave you a red pen and a black pen. And the red pen was just for circling stuff, but the black pen, if you put the black pen over it, when you fed these white sheets of paper into the computer and then they'd spit out the type, they wouldn't read the black. So if you wanted to edit up something, it was so difficult. But once they started going to computers, everything changed. It's so easy compared to typing on a typewriter, with a whiteout on the old, galleys, proofs they called them, and carrying all that stuff around. I once I covered the Pirates in Philadelphia and New York, and they called it a telegram. It took a big suitcase to put it in. It's the forerunner of the fax machine, but it was so big and heavy, and it took 6 minutes a page to send it to your office. And then it would just come into the office like a printed page. Somebody else had to type it in. I had to carry that. I had to carry my portable typewriter in a suitcase when I traveled. So it's so much easier now.
No.
I could write And I got my laptop or my iPad. I could write on this thing if I wanted to.
Yep.
And I'm sitting on my porch talking to you. All this stuff has changed, but no, I think it was so much easier. Deadline writing is easier because you can edit faster. Everything's faster. When you used a portable typewriter, when you were done with the page, you'd hold it up, and a guy would come over and grab it, and he would send it to your office by that old 6-minute machine, and it was tedious.
No, I can only imagine. It's so much more efficient now to be able to write and just to cover sports in general. Like, it's just a lot more efficient. You mentioned how, when you first got to the Post-Gazette in the 80s, how, Chuck Nolan missed the playoffs for 4 straight seasons. And I know for a lot of, beat reporters, they dream of those opportunities to cover their team when they go on make a deep playoff run or win a championship. But covering teams that are either, mediocre or don't make the playoffs, do they produce better stories?
Oh yeah, it's you want a team to be either great or terrible as a journalist. Those are the best stories. Mediocrity is mediocrity. I mentioned the Maulers before. They were 3-15, and it was some of the best stories I've ever had came out of that season. The Steelers, the strike year was one of my favorite years. Now that had nothing to do with record. They didn't make, but it was just interesting. 1987. 1988, they went 5-11. Phenomenal stories that year. In fact, there was a book. A guy followed them around all year that year because he thought they were going to be good. A writer, he used to write for Sports Illustrated, Sam Poperoff. He lived in Long Island at the time, and he followed them all over, thinking they were going to be good, and they went 5-11. But he still wrote the book, and it's a pretty good book. It's called Lost Sundays. So they either had to be great or terrible, and they were terrible, and it turned into a good book, and there was a lot of good stories that year. Chuck had a wind-up. He almost quit because they ordered him to fire some coaches, and a lot happened that year. So, yeah, it's always been interesting, Lucas. Super Bowl years or 5-11 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you want. I mean, just to have that sort of, compare and contrast. But, I feel like a lot of the athletes who are on those teams, they're just a lot more revealing, because, when their team's doing well, there's a lot more eyeballs, there's a lot more excitement in the city. But then when the team isn't doing well, people are a lot more, upset, and you get those better quotes. You get those resonating quotes from those losing teams.
We often would have, you can tell online how many people read the stories, and we often would have people read more if they lost than if they won again. And the comments after, it would be triple the number of comments after the stories when they lost than when they won. It's just, I guess it's human nature.
And you've had a chance to cover many Super Bowls. And one of the guests I've had on this show, Dan Pompei, who's a senior NFL writer at The Athletic, he also has covered a lot of Super Bowls. He's been a pool reporter as well. And, he just mentioned about trying to find the little nuggets, in Super Bowl week, because there's hundreds and hundreds of reporters that are covering this big event. Did you find it was easier to cover the Super Bowl when the Steelers were playing or when they were not playing?
Oh, when they were playing, Lucas. I mean, everybody. They know you. They're more apt to talk to you or tell you good stuff than maybe some anonymous reporter from Kalamazoo. They just I enjoyed. I didn't know what it would be like as a beat guy. I did cover that Super Bowl in '79, but I wasn't the beat guy. I was just running around doing stories. There's a lot more pressure on you when you're the beat guy and your team's in the Super Bowl. So I didn't know what that was going to be like, and I didn't know until '95. I'd been on a beat for 10 years before they went to a Super Bowl, and just thoroughly enjoyed it. I really did. The whole week is much more interesting when you're covering, when you're covering the Patriots versus, I don't know, the Eagles, you're starving for local stories because nobody wants to read about the Patriots starting left tackle or, people in Pittsburgh, they don't want to read about the Patriots at all.
They don't want to read about the Eagles.
But, I always try and find local angles, maybe somebody from Pittsburgh, some connection of some sort, or them talking about the Steelers, anything, because I know when I go to a Super Bowl and the Steelers aren't in it, if I don't come up with those kinds of stories, nobody's going to read them. Nobody's going to read a feature story on Nick Foles of the Eagles. You know what I mean? Nobody in Pittsburgh.
Chat about one of the Super Bowls that Pittsburgh won, and speaking of the pressure that you felt about covering the Steelers in a Super Bowl, and that's Super Bowl 43, Steelers versus Cardinals. And for me, like as a young kid, like this was one of the more memorable Super Bowls that I've ever witnessed. And there were so many moments from this game, from the James Harrison interception return for a touchdown to the Cardinals coming back and Larry Fitzgerald's late fourth quarter touchdown to, of course, Santonio Holmes' great catch. When you're a writer at the Super Bowl trying to, put a bow on this game, which of those moments was the most significant and why?
Well, I just wrote about this. I talked to James Harrison and had him go through step by step. We're getting some lawnmower action here. Lucas, is that cutting into the audio?
No, it's all good.
All right. I'm sitting on a porch. I can go inside.
No, it's all good.
All right. James Harrison, for me, detailed what he was thinking on the play, why he did what he did, and then step by step as he returned it, he even talked about which teammates were blocking this and which was blocking that, and how he said he was dog-ass tired. And people were still slapping him on the back and said, leave me alone, I'm tired. But that, to me, was the most significant play. You can point out any number of Super Bowl winning catches, but the Cardinals were about to take the lead just before the half. They were right down there knocking on the door, and that turned the whole thing around. Without that, I don't think they win. So to me, you could say that's the biggest play in Super Bowl history, and you won't be wrong.
No, I mean, and you're absolutely right, because look, I mean, we've seen great catches. David Tyree, Santonio Holmes, Lynn Swann back in Super Bowl 10, John Stallworth, Malcolm Butler's interception with the Patriots.
Right.
So catches are more prevalent, but like to see a defensive player of James Harrison's stature, and you make the great point about Arizona about to take the lead, that swing at the end of the first half was so critical for the Steelers to win the game.
Yeah, actually, I voted for James for MVP.
Wow.
MVP vote, and I voted for him because it was such a spectacular play. I mean, if it was a fast defensive back doing that, what's the closest thing? Leon Lett, maybe, but that game was out of hand anyway, that game against Buffalo with Dallas. And he didn't score.
No, he didn't.
Right, and that's the way it ended with him tumbling on the two kids at the end, Fitzgerald and the other wide receiver. Oh, darn. They're both from Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Cardinals. He landed on one. He went to Woodland Hills High School, which I can almost hit with a rock from here. And Fitzgerald went to Pitt. And if he doesn't land – what's that kid's name? Begins with a B. Darn it.
Anquan
If he doesn't land on him – no, it wasn't Bolden. It was Brett. It'll come to me. Right after we're done, it'll come to me. But if he doesn't land on him, he's down before the goal line. But because he landed on him, he wasn't down yet. And then he tumbled head first into the end zone. It was just that whole play was phenomenal.
So I want to hear your process as a writer because, again, like this is a game where the Steelers, have a big lead. The Cardinals come back. They take a 3-point lead. are you like, do you already have two stories depending on the result before the whole Ben Roethlisberger game-winning drive? And then what are you doing after the game? Like, are you like running down to get those early quotes?
3 stories.
Okay.
Started writing one when the Steelers were winning. And then when Fitzgerald scored, I go, oh my God, I gotta rip all that up. So I started writing another one. Now even though the game starts at 6:30, we have to have ours in by, I think it was 10:30 or so. So the game, I've roughly got 40 minutes to write, maybe.
Wow.
I forget when the game ended. So I'm writing some stuff at halftime, and I'm writing some stuff in the second half. And so, like I said, I was crafting a lead that the Steelers won, and I put that aside. And that's what I said about computers. It makes it easier. I just put that in another file and started another one. And that great, all that I could think of, and I think I was writing this in my lead, that great defense they had, that great LeBeau defense in 2008 was going to be shredded by the Arizona freaking Cardinals.
Yeah.
You know? And then, when Santonio Holmes won it, then I pushed that one aside, went back to my other one, inserted the details. But I don't go downstairs for Super Bowls because I don't have the time. And it's a waste for me as the beat guy to do so. We have 1 million people there. They go down, they gather quotes. They're looking for one little angle, all of them. I have to do the big picture. They pipe in interviews. They type up interviews and bring them to you. So what I do is I write that story, and then let's say I got 15 minutes left. I'm trying to grab interviews and throw in some appropriate comments from players into that story. And then once I send that story in, I would have to redo it, polish it up for the next edition.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of, deadline writing and writing under pressure, I mean, those early experiences, right? I mean, at all the papers that you've been to certainly prepare you for a moment like that where, you have to write in 40 minutes.
That's a good point, Lucas. When I worked at other papers, I've only worked at really one PM paper. Everything else was morning papers, and our deadlines are before midnight, long before midnight usually. I would cover a high school football game on Friday night. You'd have to drive to it, obviously, and I would have to drive back to the office to write it because I didn't have portable computers at the time. And as I'm driving, I'm trying to craft a lead in my head, so that when I get there, I can hit the ground running.
I want to shift gears to your transition to The Athletic, because I know a lot of print journalists have made the same transition. And I'm just sort of curious what compelled you to go to The Athletic and how your approach has changed writing for digital media compared to print media.
Well, let me just say one thing. If I'd have stayed at the Post-Gazette, I'd be writing for digital media too, because they're only printing 3 times a week now.
Yeah.
They're going all online as well. But there are no deadlines, first of all, Lucas, that we just talked about. Those are all out the window. I could take as much time as I want if I covered a Super Bowl right now. And we have 2 guys. Mark Caboli's the other one who covers the Steelers with me. He had been there a year or so before me. I had reached a point in my late 60s that I really didn't want to be the beat guy anymore. I didn't want to try and remember, was it his left ankle that was sprained or his right ankle? Which editors always ask. Which ankle is it? One of the 2. So I was getting ready to go to the Post-Gazette to see if I could cut back on that and just write. When The Athletic came knocking last April, I was on vacation in South Carolina, and I got a text, and we talked, and boom, I got offered the job. And when I told him what I wanted to do, he said, that's exactly what we want you to do. I said, I want to write. I want to write good stories. I don't want to have to worry about, left ankle, right ankle, the third round pick signing and what they got for his contract. I didn't want to worry about that anymore. And he said, that's exactly what we want you to do. And that's exactly what I've been able to do. And I've been able to fan out and do some, they're open to almost anything. It really is a writer's place. I mean, I told you I wrote about my covering the 79 series. I've written stuff that I talked to Dick Groat, who is a local icon here, about his career and everything, and how he had both his World Series rings stolen, but just stuff like that I've been able to do. Besides, the Steelers are still my main thing. And I've been able to write about older stuff, what are they doing now stuff. I talked to Terry Bradshaw. I got 2 stories out of him. I just talked to Willie Parker on what he's doing now and recalling his time with the Steelers. Just all kinds of different things. And the money was a lot better, I'll tell you that. The benefits are a lot better. The pressure's a lot less. So it was it was a no-brainer. And I'm like late 60s, and I didn't need to be out proving myself anymore and trying to, just upward mobility somewhere. But I did find it with this place. I love this place. I love the Athletic. I really do.
No, for sure. And to me, what's so amazing about the Athletic, Ed, is and we have the Athletic here in Canada, which does primarily hockey and basketball and some baseball. But, it's amazing that a place like the Athletic can have, writers like yourself and Dan Pompei, who've been covering the sport for years, but then, younger writers as well, who are just starting out, have the opportunity to cover certain sports. So it's certainly, like you say, like a writer's paradise, because in an industry that's, constricting and cutting back the number of jobs and opportunities, the Athletic just seems to be providing opportunities for both experienced and young writers.
Yeah, it'd be nice if sports came back.
Of course.
That's what we write about, Lucas. But we've been, I think, this is all across the board. They've been really creative with stuff they're coming up with, suggestions, and the writers individually, but the editors coming up with suggestions. And we have these what they call blitzes, where they'll do something on that catching up with it. I told you I caught up with Terry Bradshaw and then caught up with Willie Parker. That was one of their suggestions. Find a few guys that might be interesting stories that played for your team, and write it. And in that week they blitz it. They blitz a lot of the stories out like that. And we've had a number of topics like that where they do that, and it's really I think it's fascinating. Some of the stories they're coming up with. I mean, Stephen Nesbitt of our staff just wrote a story about the uniform Bill Mazeroski wore when he hit the famous home run to win the World Series in 1960, and there are 2 that claim they have it. Mazeroski has it, the real one, but he signed somebody else. Some other guy came up with a 1960 Pirates Mazeroski uniform, and he said, "Hey," he says, "I think this is the one you wore when you hit the home run." And he said, "Will you autograph it?" He said, "Yeah." He autographed it. He said, "This is the one I wore when I hit the home run," but he had the other one in his basement.
Oh, wow.
Crazy. It was a good story.
No, yeah. And those are the stories that I think really appeal to readers, because, they go beyond the score and the outcome of a certain game. It's deep dives into those really important stories.
Lucas, while we're talking on that, I mean, our writers have done some great stuff on Sidney Crosby and Mario Lemieux lately. And Mario Lemieux's greatest moments, Sidney Crosby in grade school. It just outstanding stuff.
No, for sure. And of course, Pittsburgh Penguins back-to-back Stanley Cup champions in the last decade. So for Pittsburgh hockey fans, they've they've definitely been blessed. But Ed, I want to end off by just talking about where the industry is going, and for young journalists and reporters who, many of whom listen to my show, and what are the challenges for a young journalist covering a beat in 2020, assuming that leave the pandemic aside, assuming that sports are happening. What are the challenges for young beat reporters today? And what advice would you have for these young journalists to try to overcome those challenges?
Well, I mentioned earlier the access isn't as good, and what all journalists need to do is get to know their subjects and let the subjects get to know you, so that they feel comfortable with you. I always thought that was a big thing, and the challenges are you don't have the opportunities to do that as much anymore, Lucas. I mean, before the locker rooms would be wide open. I mentioned that, you could walk in a coach's office. Now I haven't said boo to half the assistant coaches because you don't get to talk to them anymore. And time, when I was first covering the Steelers, they had, and they still do, training camp at St. Vincent College in Latrobe. And you go up to their great PR guy, Joe Gordon of the time, and you'd say, I'd like to talk to, I'm going back in the 70s now, I'd like to talk to Joe Green. And he says, okay. He says, let me get back to you. And he'd go, all right, Joe Green, 1:30, room 222. And you'd go there and you knock on Joe's door, and he'd open it. He had a roommate, and you'd sit in there. They had no air conditioning there, and you could spend a half hour talking to Joe Green. You could get great stories. Now you get 5 minutes maybe. You don't get that kind of time. There's more, even though there's fewer papers, there seems to be more journalists covering the teams. And they're all over the locker room. They open the locker room for 20 minutes or whatever, and a horde of people come in, and half the players see these people coming, and they go into the showers or something to hide. It's tough it'd be tough for young guys and women, but you have to make do, and just try and build relationships and get some time. And what I would say is get some phone numbers, because if they trust you enough, you could call them after hours.
No, for sure. Ed Bouchette, he is a Pittsburgh Steelers writer for The Athletic. Ed, thank you so much for sharing your insight and advice on the Wii Sports Quarantine Chronicles today.
All right, Lucas, thanks for having me on.